Our next speaker hardly needs any introduction. As an industry legend, he's actually transformed a wire shopping basket producer into the world's largest holding companies, and along the way, profoundly reshaped the ad industry. Having left now WPP almost a year ago, he has now embarked on a new venture, more determined than ever, to shake up the industry and to lead change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Martin Sorrell. Thank you, Martin, for joining us today in the conference.
Stefan. Thank you
all the way to Lisbon.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Do you want to give us a quick rundown in terms of what you're up to with your new venture?
Yeah, okay, but that'll probably take half an hour in and of itself.
5 minutes.
So shut me up when you want to shut me up. So when I left WPP, which is probably about 9 months ago, it was in May of last year, I thought about how, and some of the themes, you know, I've only been here for a few minutes, but some of the themes that I thought about then, very much front and center here in Lisbon. And I looked at what I've been doing for the last 30 years, looked at the portfolio that, you know, you called it a holding company. It's always grates with me when people describe it as a holding company. So it implies conglomerate and holding, and that's not really what it was about. But I looked at the portfolio, which was a large portfolio, a $20 billion portfolio, and looked at where the growth was. And the reason I looked at where the growth was is a McKinsey piece, which I think is quite a valuable piece of work. In fact, I met the woman who wrote it just recently. And what she was focused on was, why is it that there's such churn in the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500? You know, if you look at the companies that are in those indices today and compare them to 25 or 30 years ago, there's tremendous difference. And why is it that those that have survived? And there were three possible hypotheses. The first was brilliant CEOs, and I'm sad to tell you that it wasn't due to brilliant CEOs. The second hypothesis was cutting costs, and I'm glad to tell you that cutting costs didn't work. It wasn't sort of an amazing conclusion. That the third hypothesis was, you go where the revenue growth is. So concentrate on revenue growth, push on the open door. So I looked at the WPP portfolio and I saw three areas of growth. What we now call the Holy Trinity. Everybody refers to this as a monastery. It's actually a convent. And Media Monks is about monks. And I've always said that to Victor and Wesley, the two founders of Media Monks, that we should have a nunnery as well, and nuns. So this is very, very, very sort of relevant in relation to that. But the Holy Trinity, as we call it, are first-party data. That was the first area. Kantar is being sold at the moment, but if you looked at it, Kantar World Panel, Kantar Media, Lightspeed, the online panel would be areas that I would be interested in. So first-party data, which fuels and drives online content, digital content, a VML, a Wonderman, an Ogilvy One, if you could still separate it, a Wonderman. And the third area, digital media planning and buying, which we now call programmatic. the sort of thing that Essence or Xaxis, maybe a bit more controversially, although I think Xaxis was misunderstood, particularly by the advertisers. We can go into that if you like. Those three areas are the key areas. So S4 Capital has 4 principles. One is pure digital. I know that some people think you can't separate one from the other, and I probably would agree with that. But the fundamental reason to focus on digital is that's where the growth is. The industry is about $1 trillion. The people in this room represent about $1 trillion. A bit of controversy around that. PwC and Redburn, a hedge fund or an analytical company in the UK, came out with a survey saying it was 1.7 trillion. It was an important distinction they made because 400 billion of the incremental 700 billion came from trade budgets, trade promotion, which is where Amazon focuses on. It doesn't focus on the marketing budget. It focuses on the sales organization. That's why many CMOs are frustrated because they don't have control of the sales budget as well. But in any event, we're focused on purely digital, 200 billion out of the trillion, or 200 billion out of the traditional media and digital. And I'd remind you of that 200 billion, Google represents 125 billion last year, Facebook 50 billion, so it's 175, and number 3 is Amazon, which is 10 billion, which I feel, and I'll go as far as to predict, will be a $100 billion platform in due course, but will come out of the trade budgets primarily, and will come out of the long tail. Remember that Google and Facebook, 60 to 70% of their revenue does not come from the sort of people in this room. It comes from the long tail, small and medium-sized businesses. In fact, if I was Nick Clegg at Facebook, I would be running a campaign about Facebook being the driver. Sheryl Sandberg used a statistic at Davos and at DLD in Munich of 91 million businesses, small businesses that are on Facebook driving their business. It's the engine of small business growth. So purely digital, holy trinity of first-party data, content, and programmatic, a unitary structure, no earnouts. What we're very focused on. Earnouts are good ways of buying service businesses, but they create fragmentation. And what clients want increasingly is the best people working on their business. They don't care about our agency brands. They care about getting access to the best people. We care about it. We interview with Ad Age or Campaign or The Drum or Marketing Week or Marketeer here in Portugal, and we're worried about our brands, but the clients don't care anymore, in my view, about that. They want the best people. And the last and one of the most important principles is faster, better, cheaper. That sounds like a throwaway line, but it resonates, in my experience, enormously with CEOs, CMOs, CFOs, CPOs, procurement officers, CIOs, CTOs, chief sales officers, chief revenue officers, whatever you want to call them. Big resonance there. And I want to pick up on just one point that Jeff mentioned. He talked about speed. The one thing that always comes up in conversations with clients in the context of S4, particularly in the last 9 months, is speed, or rather, I would say, the lack of speed. Every legacy organization, including those holding companies, failed to move at high speed. And the number of conversations that we've had with senior management at the companies we deal with or don't deal with, at the frustration that senior management have at the inability of their organizations to move quickly is extraordinary. But the reason is, in part, due to the way, and I would put myself in that category when I was trying to run WPP, we fall victim. You have an analog part of the business, a legacy part of the business, and let's call it the digital part of the business. And the analog part of the business, the legacy part of the business, is the cash cow. That's the one that generates does things in the old-fashioned way. Generates revenues, just like digital, but it generates profits and margins, all those things that we've sort of forgotten about. A little bit of cynicism there. But when that analog part of the business starts to falter, we jump on it. If you get to the end of the first quarter or the second quarter and they're not making budget, you jump on them. And Arianna Huffington has I think, a very good phrase. She says that failure is not the opposite to success, it's the platform to success, and she's dead right. Because when you castigate or criticize the analog part of the business for failing, you make people frightened to experiment and frightened to expand into the digital part of the business. So major conversations that we have are on that. So
Thank you.
That's what's been absorbing me for the last 9 months.
That was 8 minutes, okay?
Okay.
So it almost sounds that the model you're devising is a model which is going to be bypassing agencies and going to compete head-on with the consultants?
Well,
or is that just an impression?
That sort of says, Stefan, that you think we're not an agency. And Pete Kim, who runs Mighty Hive, doesn't refer to Mighty Hive, which is our pro. So we have two major sort of pillars. We haven't built the first-party data pillar as yet because we're depending on clients for first-party data. We're with Netflix, for example, or with Sprint. They provide us with the first-party data, or Google, they provide us with the first-party, or Amazon, or Facebook, or wherever it happens to be, or Tencent, or Alibaba. They provide us with the first-party data. We'll get into that in due course. But the two pillars are the Media Monks content pillar and the Mighty Hive programmatic pillar. And Pete, who came from Google 6 years ago and started Mighty Hive in San Francisco, always refers to Mighty Hive as a consultancy and not an agency or agency network. But we're not displacing. I mean, I think it's fair for you to say, Stefan, that we're competing. You know, if I went back to Media Monks 4 or 5 years ago, 80%, Jeff mentioned Wyden and Kennedy. Media Monks have worked closely with Wyden and Kennedy for many, many years. And 4 or 5 years ago, the work that Media Monks did was through agencies. Today it's reversed. It's now more and more direct, but they're almost operating as an agency. And why I particularly like the idea of coming to talk to you here, given the opportunity at the WFA, is that, you know, a large part of the audience is client and client-orientated. Effectively, what we've done, and we may have accurately forecast this or predicted this or calculated this or inaccurately. Effectively what we've done is try and analyze the areas where clients express concern about the agency model, whether you call it holding company model or whatever, and tried to repair the damage, because there was damage. Whether it was real damage in the sense of it was concern about real things or perception. I felt, you know, having tried to run one of those holding companies, that it was more about perception than reality, but wouldn't I, because I had a sort of vested interest in it. But what we've tried to do is to look at the model. So, for example, I think one of the problems, and I was very instrumental in building the agency model around clients, whether it be Ford with GTB, whether it be Colgate with Red Fuse, whatever. And one of the unintended consequences of that is that clients felt that they were surrounded. It wasn't intended. You know, I used to sit there thinking about what can we do for clients that would make it what we do better. Certainly, you know, reinforce and strengthen the relationship. So it was also about incumbency. And clients, I think, got, for a number of reasons which we should go into, got really concerned about agency incumbency. And what we do now is we go to a client and we'll say, what is the best model? I mean, just picking up on what Jeff said about Airbnb, you know, he has in-house content. I don't know whether you do in-house programmatic, Jeff, or not, in-house media planning and buying, but we go to the clients and say, we'll do anything along the spectrum with you. We'll in-house, we'll have a hybrid model, half in, half out, or you can outsource it to us. But we will do what is your interest, not what is in our interest. And I think clients felt there was an incumbency problem, that all agencies, not all, part of what agencies were trying to do was to make themselves indispensable. And that was a tough one for two reasons, and probably another 8 minutes for two reasons. Firstly, post-Lehman, post-2008, now here I am in Portugal, and Portugal was a really important part of that crisis for good or bad reasons. Post-2008, GDP growth in the world has been less than before 2008, fact. And they're about 100 basis points, about 1 percentage point less on average. Why? Because inflation has been less. And that has meant that the clients in this room and elsewhere have been unable to exercise the pricing power that they used to exercise. I mean, it's no accident that Latin America shows growth, in part because there's higher inflation there, and it gives more wiggle room for clients. But basically, that's the reason why the rise of finance and procurement, which is a real problem. You know, if marketing was up here before 2008 or around 2008, and finance and procurement was there, today finance and procurement's there, I would say it's up here. And that's one of the things I think the new president of the WFA is concerned about or has highlighted. I agree totally with that. That's something that we really have to balance. Not the demise, but the criticism of ZBB recently, zero-based budgeting, might redress the balance. But watch out, because the ZBB people, the people who run those companies, are very clever people. They will course correct. And they'll course correct by investing more in innovation and branding. That will become really important. But basically, after 2008, cost and cost control became very important. So that was one thing. The second thing that happened around 2016 was the platforms started to say, and the principal platforms being the fearsome five, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Tencent, and Alibaba, they started to say, we will not share the data with you, either for real reasons, privacy, brand safety, interference in elections, or whatever, or they might have been using it as a fig leaf. I think it's more probably the former than the latter. But the warning bell went off, and clients started to get worried about their ability to connect closely with consumers. Direct to consumer, again, which has come up at this conference quite a lot, became more and more critical. Unilever bought Dollar Shaving Club, not because it wanted to go into the shaving business against Gillette and Procter, but because it wanted direct relationships with consumers. Coke buys Costa for the same reasons. Nestle buys Starbucks retail rights for the same reasons. So as the walls started to go up, clients were faced with the fact that they denuded themselves of marketing resources because of cost control, and they wanted at the same time to build relationships direct to the consumer, first-party data, content, and programmatic. So they're starting to look at their own models and in-house more and build their resources. So that's, I think, what's been happening.
At our conferences, we tend to talk a lot about the agency of the future.
Yeah.
But what about the client of the future? Now, you've been well placed to see that, both at WPP and now at S4. Yeah. What do you feel the client of the future?
Well, I know you had Keith Weed here this morning. I don't know whether he's still here, so I'll risk telling a little anecdote about, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago. We had regular meetings with Keith, still do. And I went to see him at Unilever House on the Embankment in London, and he was particularly grumpy. And I said, why are you so grumpy? He said, well, I've been with Tesco for 3 hours, so why shouldn't I, exhibit a little bit of referred pain on you? Why shouldn't I transfer some of the aggravation? So I think that's a real issue. And what has happened over the last few years is that the agencies have been put under pressure. And the question you raise, and I hesitate to raise this because there are a bunch of clients in here and maybe a bunch of clients listening.
Be brave.
And I don't want to offend them, so I'll caveat.
You have a reputation.
But look, of offending. But the clients have to change too. There's no point in us just being put under pressure, either proactively or reactively, to change our structure unless the client structure changes. I touched on where Amazon hits. Irrespective of the fact that Amazon goes after the long tail, they do have big relationships with the short tail. But they go after the trade budgets. They go after that 400 billion that I mentioned. And that's a different part of the organization. I can remember 3 conversations with major CMOs, all of packaged goods companies actually, who've said to me, They're very concerned about the fact that they don't control the sales function or don't integrate with the sales function. And ironically, the tobacco companies, and maybe to a lesser extent the drinks companies, who were precluded from, regulated in terms of advertising and marketing, were the first to start to look at this issue of consolidating sales and marketing, and to some extent have done so. Not wholly, but have done so. And I remember some of the tobacco company CMOs have said to me, they think their experience would be highly relevant today in the era of Amazon and Tencent and Alibaba in China. And I would say, by the way, the data issue, the big battleground with the platforms is in the data area. That's where the tussle is taking place. And the problem on first-party data is most of the companies, so most of them are grown by acquisition, the client companies, and they've got different platforms. It's a structural issue. Different platforms that don't, or different IT networks don't talk to one another. And the cost of getting them synchronized and tabulated together is very high. And often they aren't willing to take that cost. And the new tech companies, of course, don't have that problem. So their structure is really, change in their structure is really important.
You've already touched upon ZBB and the impact it has had, but if you look, over the last 10 years, the impact which activist shareholders have had on the pressure on companies, and what we've been seeing recently, how do you forecast this is going to be playing out? Are you seeing actually brand building and marketing recovering from some of the pressure?
Well, it sort of brings me a little bit back to the Ritson article. I mean, I hesitate to say this because I may get chastised for saying it, but I think we over-intellectualize about purpose. I remember John Brown, Lord Brown, who ran BP, in 1997 at Stanford Business School gave a speech about what we now call purpose, and said that, I think quite rightly, that if you are in the business of building brands for the long term, and the critical thing was long term, you will not do things that offend your stakeholders. So if you're an oil company, you won't rip it with oil out of the ground and destroy the environment. You'll take care of the environment. So when Ritson says, you have to sacrifice profit, he's right in the short term, I think, but not the long term. Because if you are purposeful, and if you take into account the interests of all your stakeholders, you will build your profitability over the long. You won't sacrifice it in the long term. So I think it's a really important point. So coming back to ZBB, they were too short term. They forgot. Jorge Lehmann said to me 6 or 7 years ago, who's the guy who's at the top of 3G, with Beta Sikapura and Marcia Talas. He said to me 6 to 7 years ago that he was in a Chicago restaurant and there was a menu of 70 craft beers and not one of them was an ABI beer. So they knew years ago that as they started to strip cost out of ABI, before Sad Miller, that they were potentially running into a problem where they didn't have sufficient innovation and they didn't have enough branding. And just one other observation about that. We're interested in branding. You can have innovation without branding because a good product will get there. It's aided, enhanced, it's magnified by great marketing. But you can have innovation without branding, but you can't have branding without innovation. So the core, that money that I think the ZBB criticism recently, it's good news for us, will be deployed and invested in innovation and then deployed into branding. And one other thing about, this stuff about millennial brands, the great brand masters and mistresses, the great ones, it's taken them time to adapt, but they are getting there. Those millennial brands that pop up in China or Brazil or the Western markets and garner a 2 or 3, 4 share, and head office is calling the country manager or the brand manager and saying, what the hell's going on? Why have our sales flattened out when they were growing? And the guy running, the woman running the brand say, well, it's because of these millennial brands. The traditional brands, the reputable brands, the older brands, have it all in their hands to a change and adapt if they innovate. I remember I was watching CNBC's Squawk Box, and there was a woman about 6 months ago, a woman on one early morning in New York, who'd raised $4 billion for an organic baby food brand. And I thought to myself, you know, if I was at one of the big companies, you know, that do baby food, but it was Nestle or whatever it is, surely they have the ability to do that. They have, you know, they have the innovation, they have the production, they have the distribution, they have the marketing. Why is it that they don't do it? And it comes back to this vertical, siloed problem, speed problem, lack of speed problem. I think Alan Jope is doing a very interesting thing at Unilever, just taken over from Paul Polman, as I understand it. You know, Paul Polman talked about doubling the size of the company and keeping the environmental pattern constant, the footprint constant. What Alan is going to talk about, or is talking about, is doubling the speed and having fun. And doubling the speed, I think that's really smart, because I think doubling the speed is a key issue. Getting flexibility, it's the problem that the holding companies have, where we started this conversation. I mean, that's their problem. Look at the 4A's reports from this week, I think it was in Florida, where several people who run parts of holding companies said, we're too siloed, we're too fragmented, we don't move fast enough.
And you can decline to respond to the next question. What about holding companies, the future of holding companies?
Look, I'm still the largest individual shareholder, for good reasons or bad reasons, in WPP. Look, let's put, it's an interesting question. Let's put Havas to one side, because they've been sort of swallowed up inside Vivendi. And in fact, Vivendi, you could argue, is the largest of the six. It has a market cap of about 30 billion euros. And let's put Dentsu to one side for a minute, because I think Dentsu's model is probably the best, because it's the closest to the S4 Capital model, which is media-driven, digital and data, Merkle. And let me, I don't want to offend the Japanese, but the Japanese seem to have a focus at the minute of trying to kick out the gaijins. I mean, we saw that with Renault and Carlos Ghosn, and we've seen it a bit inside Dentsu, you know, kicking out Nick Waters and kicking out Jerry Bullman. You know, Japanese seem to be concerned very much about control. So let's put them to one side. That leaves you with four, two of which are American-based, IPG and Omnicom, and two of which are European-based, WPP in London and Publicis in Paris. Now, if you look at the two Americans, Omnicom, and I don't want to be offensive, but here we go. Omnicom has no strategy. John Wren does not have a strategic bone in his body. But, and anybody who's quoting me, get the full quote together, but he has extremely good businesses. No strategy, execution good, maybe excellent. IPG is smaller, had its problems in 2000, took 8 years to get out of the problems. Maybe it's easier to manage, it's dominated by McCann, and that's an integrated business, sort of like a mini WPP or Omnicom. So I would say they haven't strategically moved, but executionally they've been very good, and they have one big advantage: they're both based in New York. And I would say, if you want to run a global business, you know, Shanghai is still, or Beijing is still not the center yet. It's still New York. And that's where, you know, 20 trillion out of 70 trillion GDP resides, and the big multinationals. I always used to ruminate on the fact that if I was in New York, within 2 days, I could visit in the northeast of America about 2/3 of WPP's client base. It's still, whether we like it or not, it's still the heart of the industry, despite, you know, the growth of Silicon Valley, et cetera. So the two Americans have that advantage. They haven't gone strategically to the one firm model, and they're based in America. On the flip side, Publicis and WPP have done, I think, have got the right strategies. One firm strategies are the way to go. That's the way to go. I'm totally convinced of that. But the trouble is, when you consolidate stuff in our industry, it's really difficult. 1 and 1 does not make 2. 1 and 1 doesn't make 2.5. It doesn't make 2. It often doesn't make 1.5. It often doesn't make even 1. So the structural changes that are forced through a change in that strategy in the short term cause tremendous disruption. So I think that's the way. And then the other thing is they're run from London and Paris. And that doesn't work. You can't do spreadsheet management from London or Paris. It just, you have to be on the ground. And this applies, geographically. If China for many of our clients is the largest market in which they operate, despite the trade war and everything, or the second largest, or the third largest. If you think about it in those terms, you have to be into those markets as well. You can't do it from, as I say, from Paris or London.
Martin, 2 questions left, and you have 1 minute per question max.
Okay, fine.
One is, where are we heading with Brexit? 1 minute.
I can do that in 10 seconds. I've absolutely no idea.
Okay.
I would just say, as an unreformed Remainer, I hope it carries, this fiasco carries on for the next 6 months, and we remain where we are. But that's probably a fool's hope.
And the other question is, what's your outlook on the economy? Where are we heading in the next 12 to 18 months?
I think probably people have got over gloomy. I think at Davos it was very interesting, actually. The people from the government weren't there because they were sorting out their problems at home. Trump was dealing with the government bloc. Theresa May was in the UK, and Macron, I think, stayed in France dealing with his problems, the Gilets jaunes. So government people sort of were dealing with their troubles. People who run companies at Davos were sort of a little bit gloomy. The financiers were pretty positive. And I think it's overblown about the US economy and the slowdown. I don't think there will be a recession, certainly in front of the US election. I think Trump will win again. The Mueller report gives him a new lease of life. And not that he was, I think, going to lose before the Mueller report, but gives him, I think, momentum. And his base, and he hasn't done anything against his base. The other thing is, remember, Trump, whatever you think about Trump personally, he's good for business. The tax reduction, the regulation reduction, what will probably happen is more infrastructure spending will be good for business. And, it's a bit like Bolsonaro in Brazil. I mean, he's got a lot of challenges, but the indices, the stock market indices have hit highs. I mean, he's got some practical problems in pension reform and everything else to do. But these, extreme leaders do from a business. Obama, on the other hand, was complete reverse. Obama and Theresa May didn't really they don't like business. They don't like business people. They think they have, whenever they speak to a business person, that person has an agenda. And it's remarkable. I'm on the Business Council in the United States. It's the top 100 CEOs. They let a few foreigners in. The top 100 CEOs in America. It's remarkable the difference, certainly privately, of the attitude of business leaders in America now as to what it was under the 8 years of Obama. So I feel sort of not bearish about America, as bearish as others, but except until after the election. China, I'm a big bull on. I was in China over the weekend at the Development Forum. I'm a very big bull on China. I mean, unstoppable force. Don't underestimate their technology. Their technology, maybe with the exception of semiconductor chips, is arguably ahead of ours. All the criticism of Huawei. I've been on the campus of Huawei, 50,000 people in the Shenzhen campus. A formidable company, despite all the pressure on them. And it goes beyond that to, Xiaomi and others. I mean, it's incredible, technologically driven, with a technological ecosystem which is so different to our own. They don't have credit cards anymore. They don't have cash anymore. You know, WeChat payment systems, extraordinary. So don't underestimate and go on about that. I mean, I think what you're seeing at the moment is a G2 struggle. It's a struggle to be top dog. And that's why, just in relation to forecasts, I think there will be a trade agreement, but what I worry about, which is good news, but I worry about the long term, because I think it's inevitable that the US and China will bang heads. I don't think China is expansionist in an aggressive way, but Chinese soft power is very strong, very strong. You see Italy even becoming a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, so it's quite extraordinary.
Thank you very much, Martin. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
Sir Martin Sorrell.
Thank you,
Thank you, Martin. Well done.